Well, before we begin the formal proceedings, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm Scott Brenton. I'm the coordinator of the Doctoral Academy, which we're about to launch this evening. Many people have been asking me, as I've been mixing and mingling, what is the Doctoral Academy? So I thought I might say a few words on that. But I also wanted to say that the members of the Doctoral Academy, the PhD students, are really going to be driving the agenda as we go forward. So as much as I'm coordinating it, I'm really sort of guiding the process rather than sort of saying this is what it is and this is what we're going to do. But broadly speaking, it's about bringing together PhD students who are working on topics related to government and the School of Government's research themes, which broadly look at sort of policy impact. So making the PhD experience a little bit less isolating and getting people to engage outside of their discipline and to be able to pick up ideas, methods, different ways of thinking from other people working on similar topics. And the other thing we're wanting to do is to be engaging in broader policy debates and be looking at having an impact beyond just the academy. And it's for this reason that I'm thrilled to invite our special guest who will be launching the academy, Dr. Tim Soutphommasane. And he was our number one choice, and I'm thrilled that he was able to come and launch it because he's an example of someone who only very recently actually received his PhD, yet has managed to make a big impact within the academy. He has 3 books to his name already, but has also been working outside of the academy, and most of you will not know him and know his work through opinion pieces or other media engagement where he's talked about racial discrimination issues. So Tim is, of course, the Race Discrimination Commissioner in the Human Rights Commission. Oxford graduate, as I mentioned, a distinguished academic career, and someone who's transitioned between both worlds. And to show an example of someone, a PhD graduate, who's been able to have those types of impacts. So I won't take any more time away from our very special guest, so I'd like to throw over to Dr. Tim Soutphommasane, and if you could warmly invite him to officially launch the Melbourne School of Government Doctoral Academy.
Well, thanks very much, Scott, for that welcome, and I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Let me begin by recalling an encounter I had not long ago with Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. He was visiting Australia a few years ago with the Queen, and I had the chance to have a brief conversation with him, and he asked me, "What do you do?" So I answered, "I'm a political philosopher." And he responded by asking me again, "What do you do?" And I explained to him, "Well, I conduct research on national identity, citizenship and multiculturalism." To which he responded, "So what do you do?" And I realized then that I needed to break this down a bit more and really have a hard think about what I actually did. So I told him, "Well, I guess I sit, I read, I think and I write." To which the prince responded, "And they pay you?" I begin with that to underline just how much of a luxury it is to be able to have the time and freedom to sit, read, think and write. But none of it is idle time, and your efforts, of course, are not efforts of dilettantes, but efforts of scholars and practitioners. And the work that I know that you're conducting at the moment will be directed at various arenas and areas and will have an impact in how we conduct our public life. I know that's the aspiration of the School of Government, like the many other schools of government that exist across the country. So I applaud the University of Melbourne for establishing this doctoral academy. As Scott says, one of the challenges with doctoral work is to be able to find networks of support, to be able to share your experiences and to learn from others, including others from other disciplines. We never know where innovation comes from. Sometimes it's the tangential connections that we make or the random conversations we have over coffee or lunch, or even a function like this tonight. That's the beauty of scholarship, and I've always been a believer in serendipity, in the idea of heading into a library, and I guess I'm old-fashioned in preferring the hard copy version of books, but exploring your bookshelf, and at least in my experience, you always leave the library finding a book that you didn't intend on retrieving, and usually it's that book that gives you the insight that you're after, or that leads you down a path in your research that you would not have anticipated. Let me say a little about the ways in which research in your work may shape our public debates. There is a premium on good evidence-based research in public policy debates today. That is one contribution that may emerge from your scholarship. But in addition to that, there's also the conceptual work that you can add. Namely, how we define our concepts is fundamental to how we deliberate as citizens. Quite often we have contests over basic building blocks of our political life, and it's to experts that we often turn for guidance. In my own work on race discrimination, for example, I constantly return to what racism must mean. You'd think it was a pretty basic proposition for my work, but yet it's always a challenge to refresh our understanding of that concept, or what discrimination must mean. And concepts will change over time as well to reflect the societies in which we live and we operate. When I think of matters of race, for example, I think of how perhaps in the 50s and 60s we may well have regarded racism as being just about a belief in a doctrine of racial superiority, but we know today that you needn't understand racism in that way. You don't need to be a card-carrying member of an organisation dedicated to racial superiority to be prejudiced or to discriminate against people on race or ethnicity. We've seen the emergence of a new phenomenon, the emergence of casual racism or everyday racism, where people can say or do things, and they can be jokes, they can be throwaway comments, or they can be other forms of behaviour which have the effect of belittling or demeaning or degrading people, when that may not necessarily be accompanied by an intention. I use this example as an illustration of how things can change over time, and of how research can help us understand our social world. I certainly draw on the empirical work that people do, for example, in public health, like the Lowicher Institute here at the University of Melbourne, on the impacts of racism on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in particular. But I draw on conceptual work that's done on casual racism or everyday racism too. There are two types of innovation, I believe, in thinking and in scholarship. And I draw this thinking from, and this is an illustration of how interdisciplinary we can all be. I draw this from work done by a critic of art, a fellow called Galenson, American. And he said that there are two types of artistic innovation. There are the conceptualists. Here we refer to people like the F. Scott Fitzgeralds of the world, or to the Orson Welles of the world. People who manage to storm a particular scene and to rethink their entire subfield, or even their field at large. And then you have the experimentalists. You have artists like Cézanne, people who chip away at something and who master the technique that's associated with their work. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about how you can all innovate through your doctoral work as well, because at the end of the day, what defines doctoral research is, of course, a contribution. It used to be defined in terms of originality. I know a lot of universities don't require you to fulfill the demand of originality now to get your doctorate, but nonetheless the spirit remains the same. You all have a contribution to make through your research, and I think it can sometimes be about rethinking something in one fell swoop, but more often than not it's probably going to be about something at the edges, that experimental type of innovation that I've referred to. Let me reflect now on just some of the challenges that we face at the moment in the area of race and human rights. I think in the past few months we've seen a distinct challenge emerge in the area of community harmony in light of the official raising of the terror alert to high, and in light of international events, particularly in Iraq and Syria. I certainly know in the past few months that members of some communities, namely Muslim and Arab communities, have been making very clear to me that they believe they've been singled out for unfair treatment. We know from media reports that a number of mosques around the country have been defaced with anti-Islamic slogans. There's been property damage. There have been countless other incidents, not always reported, of women wearing Islamic dress being abused, harassed or intimidated in public places. I'm very disappointed by this turn in events. We should not be judging an entire community by the actions of a very few. In this case, we should not be judging Muslim Australians by the actions of a fanatical few. The vast and overwhelming majority of Australians who practice the Islamic faith are law-abiding and loyal Australian citizens, and they are entitled to equal respect. Certainly they are not deserving of the kind of anti-Islamic prejudice we are seeing at the moment. Some of this prejudice is being rehearsed in insidious forms. You will be familiar with some of the anti-halal campaigning that is occurring at the moment, where campaigners are targeting food companies that offer or that provide halal certification for their products and forcing, in some cases, those companies to abandon their certification. So 2 weeks ago in South Australia, the Flurio Milk and Yogurt Company decided to abandon its halal certification after being bombarded by anti-halal campaigners online and also through the telephone. There have been other companies that have stood their ground and have maintained their halal certification. 4 and 20 Pies, for example. Byron Bay Cookie Company. I believe that some of the anti-halal rhetoric has been characterised by misinformation and very thinly disguised bigotry. Some say, for example, that halal certification produces fees which are then used to fund terrorism. There's no evidence that's provided for this proposition. In fact, we have existing laws concerning terrorism and the funding of terrorism, and no company is immune from those federal criminal laws. If there are companies that fund terrorism, they should be prosecuted under the Commonwealth Criminal Code. And there's nothing in the Commonwealth Criminal Code that says that halal certification organisations are exempt. We know as well that halal slaughter is broadly consistent with the methods of slaughter that are accepted as humane in Australia. According to the RSPCA, the vast majority of halal slaughter is done involving the stunning of animals prior to their slaughter. In other words, when animals are slaughtered in Australia, they are stunned unconscious. This means that halal practices in Australia, the vast majority of those practices are consistent with animal welfare standards. And we know as well that having a product that is certified as being halal does not preclude non-Muslims from being able to enjoy those foods. According to the Australian Food and Grocery Council, halal labelling is very similar, or can be considered similar, to nut labelling or gluten-free labelling that we have with our foods. Forgive me for elaborating on all these aspects, but I do feel that this is the next emergent stage of the debate that we'll have about Islam in Australia, but the tone of the debate and the manner in which some of the campaigning against halal has taken place gives us cause for concern. You know what the justification is for all this? I get it every day. People always say to me that, well, Islam isn't a race, Tim, so you have no business talking about Islam, because Islam is a religion. The logic being, therefore, that to vent one's prejudice against Islam and against Muslims is acceptable. That somehow it isn't bigotry because it can't be considered racism. Those of you who have looked into race issues will be aware that the relationship between race and religion has always been very complex. In fact, scholars have tracked the history of racism and believe that the modern, or the prototype of modern racism, in fact emerged in the 15th and 16th centuries against Jews in Spain, namely with how Spanish authorities treated Jewish converts to Christianity. Conversos, I believe, is what they were known as. But the idea among many in Spain at the time was that the blood of Jewish people meant that they could never convert properly to Christianity. That sums up one of the essential conditions of racism. It's about cultural groups having certain qualities, usually sometimes defined in terms of race or in colour, sometimes defined in ethnicity, but which are ineradicable and cannot be changed. Now, you will have seen on TV recently, perhaps a program. I know that there's one SBS program that's been gaining much attention, but there was another program earlier this year that was equally fascinating, and that was a program called Living with the Enemy, where certain people were pitted against those with diametrically opposed beliefs or views and were made to live with each other for some time. One of the people that was chosen for this program was an Australian who believed that man who believed that Islam was incompatible with the Australian way of life, and who was made to live with an Islamic couple. He believed that there was no such thing as a moderate Muslim, that Islam was a hateful religion and was aligned with terrorism. But we saw through those exchanges a really interesting dissonance. The person in question came to accept the particular individuals as good and decent people, but he didn't deviate in believing that they were nonetheless not representative of Islam. They couldn't be representative of Islam because Islam was somehow by definition a hateful and extremist religion. An illustration there perhaps of how a religious identity can be considered an ineradicable or essential, unchanging condition. We know as well that not everyone will distinguish between race and religion. A few months ago there was an article in the Daily Telegraph where a brave correspondent was sent to the suburb of Lakemba, which is home to many Muslim communities. Inside Sydney's Muslim land was the title of this spread, and the correspondent spent 24 hours in Lakemba, and he described his time there. But in the first few sentences of the article, you had the correspondent say that Lakemba was a Muslim land, and then the correspondent said, and the ethnic mix that you would find in this Muslim land was similar to the ethnic mix you would find in any Arabic city. All in the space of a few sentences at the very top. But what's interesting is to see how you get from the headline and from a few sentences a progression from religion, then to ethnicity, and arguably to race. To put it another way, not everyone will distinguish between an Egyptian Australian who is Coptic and a Lebanese Australian who is Muslim. In many people's minds, what only matters is if you look a certain way. But what defines how you look? What makes it a condition of looking like you are Muslim, if not something like race and ethnicity? So that's my response to those who say that religion and race can be held separate. But in any case, whether it's race or religion, bigotry should have no place in our public discourse. We should be able to have our disagreements in a civil manner. We can debate religion and belief. It's important that we debate these things, and it's important that we are able to debate race as well. But none of these propositions gives us license to abuse or vilify people on the basis of their race or their religious convictions. It may be optimistic, but I certainly hope that you can have debate between citizens conducted on the basis of fact and good faith. Let me conclude by saying to you that it's a real pleasure for me to come out today. One of the great partners in the Human Rights Commission's work is the education sector, but particularly our universities. And there's a very simple reason for that. In the task of protecting and promoting human rights, education is central to our efforts. We cannot win hearts and minds. We cannot change behaviour unless we are able to educate people. But I do want to challenge you all to think of education not only in technical terms or in scholastic or scholarly terms, but also in civic terms. Education must have a civic purpose. This goes against the tide in some respects. We know, for example, that education is increasingly being defined in very instrumental terms, economistic terms. If you go to the statements, for example, offered by Universities Australia, you have higher education being described as pivotal to Australian productivity and to economic innovation and growth. They're all important things. They're part of a good society. But we need to remember that living in a market economy does not mean living in a market society. Our civic purposes still matter. And we can't underestimate too the challenge of a civic culture today. There are some who revel in their anti-intellectualism. Some will say that expanding university education, for example, is a social evil. A social evil because those of us in the academy are out of touch with so-called ordinary Australia. The implication being that we should revel in an Australia which regards conventional wisdom or superstition above scientific research and evidence. But I know that these are all matters which are close to your heart. This goes to the mission of a school of government. I commend the University of Melbourne on its efforts, and I want to wish you the very best in your efforts as researchers and scholars. And without further ado, I declare with great pleasure that I now launch the Doctoral Academy of the University of Melbourne School of Government. Thank you very much.